This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
How should we approach the Trinity to begin with? And when you go back to the greats, the church fathers, some of the medieval scholastics, the Protestant scholastics, they're not going to the Trinity to make the Trinity relevant. They would feel like that's actually quite backwards.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend, my co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you doing today?
Jonathan, I'm doing great and really looking forward to our conversation about a doctrine that couldn't be more important. Really mean that. And I think it's going to be an exciting conversation with our guest.
Well, it is a vital conversation to have, and this is and we want to revolve this around a new work that's just come out. Our guest today is Matthew Barrett, who's professor of Christian theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's author of a number of books, but this is a significant volume that he edited called On Classical Trinitarianism. The subtitle is Retrieving the Nicene Doctrine of the Triune God. So, Matthew, thanks for coming in and talking to us today.
Hey, thank you. Always a pleasure. Love what you guys are doing, and especially to talk about the Trinity.
Well, we do want to talk about the Trinity, and I want to talk about it in terms of this book that you've put together. It's a monumental achievement in many ways, and I wanted to begin with some comments you make in the introduction, because one of the ways in which you sort of set the stage for this retrieval project is the growth of social Trinitarianism and the prevalence of social Trinitarianism. And that might be unfamiliar language for some of our listeners, but I wonder if you could just start there, because you do spend a lot of time saying this is intended as a response to social Trinitarianism in all its forms. So could you explain to our listeners what that is, what it is that you have in mind, who you're targeting there?
Yeah, well, one of the difficulties is social Trinitarianism. It's sort of like trying to nail Jello to the wall, because over the last century, there's been so many different versions of it, so many different representatives. However, that said, it does have some very clear and what we would call revisionistic defining marks. And so, take someone like Jürgen Moltmann, one of the most influential theologians of the last century, is just a test case. There's a very strong push against what we would call the Trinity of, say, the Nicene Creed, or the Christology that then comes after the 4th century with, say, Chalcedon. There's a very strong push against those commitments. And what does that look like? Well, rather than defining the Trinity in the language of Nicaea, there's going to be an emphasis on, say, the three persons as a type of cooperative society. And, I'm maybe oversimplifying things here, but you can imagine where this goes. I mean, the Trinities, the persons of the Trinity start to resemble persons in a human society. In its most extreme cases, that means, well, Father, Son, and Spirit each have their own center of consciousness. Some social Trinitarians will go so far to say they even have their own will, so there would be three wills in the Trinity. And some of them would turn up their nose at maybe a doctrine like divine simplicity, that God is without parts. And as you can tell, there's a revisionism occurring. And some of them are very open about that. Some of them might want to qualify it more. But nonetheless, there's a revisionistic approach to the Trinity of Orthodoxy, as I would call it. All of this becomes quite relevant, literally, because depending on the type of social Trinity you have, they then want to really draw a very tidy line to society to say, well, then this social Trinitarianism is really the paradigm for the church or even wider society. Moltmann does this. Now, here's the thing. We could talk about how this manifests itself in any number of modern theologians, but the painful part is that it actually has influenced evangelicalism to various degrees. And I think we could talk there if you want, but it's influenced well-known evangelicals from their Trinitarianism itself to their Christology, or even to how they see the Trinity in relation to the church and society.
I was going to ask, is this the special preserve of progressive and liberal Christianity, or does this sort of, in one respect, cut across what we might often think of as the left-right divide within Christendom?
Yeah, boy, that's a really good question. I would argue, and I think a number of the contributors of the book would agree on this, that social Trinitarianism really is a product of modernity. It really is a product of modern theology. Now, of course, James, you know this very well. There are many spin-offs. You've got Protestant liberalism on one end, and then there's a whole spectrum. But the point is, rather than it being necessarily tied to even one camp, it's because it's a product of modern theology, it really has pervaded everything. And I know it's painful for us to realize, but yes, it's even pervaded our evangelical circles. So what does that mean at the end of the day? Well, it means that, yeah, we have to take an honest look at ourselves, because we can't necessarily just point the finger and say, well, those liberals over there they're the social Trinitarians. Well, actually, it's influenced pretty much every denomination, every tradition. Yeah, so it's not just this book. It might be a new book, but it's not like this is calling attention to it to the first time. Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Anglicans, they're all having to take a hard look at ourselves and say, okay, are we holding to the Trinity of Nicaea, or have we maybe bought into some of the more modern commitments of social Trinitarianism?
Matthew, I think some people think of the 20th century, and many have called it this, the century in which there was a Trinitarian revival. I mean, they really see, you're writing, here we are in 2025 now, and your book has the word retrieval in the subtitle, but it wasn't the whole 20th century about a revival. And I think but I do think you've put your finger on it, more or less in 31 different flavors, perhaps. But the Trinity that was revived was not the one that had been there before modernity, and it really did end up looking like three centers of consciousness, three wills, three centers of power, sometimes hierarchically ordered so that one person would have more power and authority than another. I think Cornelius Plantinga Jr. went as far as to say three essences, his word. And I'm confident I'm not misquoting him on that. And so it turned out that the revival was actually social Trinitarianism, and that was what made and I think that the reason people thought that was really relevant is because that made, and I want to come to this question of relevancy, that made the Trinity relevant. Yeah. That without social Trinitarianism, how is the Trinity relevant to us? Is that something that you think some of the chapters in this book address helpfully?
Yeah, absolutely. James, you've hit the nail right on the head, because it's created a flurry, not just in, say, systematic theology, but in historical theology. Lewis Ayres points this out in his book, Nicaea and Its Legacy, where he says, everyone's invited to the banquet over this excitement over a revival of Trinitarianism. And he says something, I think he's echoing Shakespeare here. He says something to the effect of, the ghost of Nicaea is sort of haunting everybody in the background. And basically what he's doing is he's calling attention to the fact that, okay, we've called it a revival, but a revival of what exactly? And then that brings up the question of relevancy, because, Moltmann, for example, there's a reason he is rethinking the Trinity in these societal terms. Well, it comes right out in his political theology, but he's not the only one. Evangelicals, you mentioned this with EFS. Many of those, like Grudem or Ware and others, have argued, well, if using the societal language of the Trinity, well, this must mean then that there is hierarchy functionally within God himself, within the Trinity. And then that from there, they've been able to move quickly to say, well, that subordination, functional subordination of the Son, that becomes the paradigm then for male, female in society, or specifically man, woman in a marriage, or leadership in the church. So you can see suddenly the Trinity being relevant becomes a massive priority. I think part of the great fruit that's come out of recent publications is we've had to say, okay, let's time out. Let's put some of our societal concerns, or even ecclesiastical ones, those are all good, but let's put those on hold for a minute. How should we approach the Trinity to begin with? And when you go back to the greats, the church fathers, some of the medieval scholastics, the Protestant scholastics, they're not going to the Trinity to make the Trinity relevant. They would feel like that's actually quite backwards. Stephen Holmes talks about this. He puts it real bluntly. He says the Trinity is not relevant. And what he means by that is not that it doesn't matter for Christianity or our Christian lives. Of course it does. What he means there is hands off. Let's not be manipulating the Trinity to make it relevant as if that's the only reason it matters. Rather, classical Christianity says, this is very much David, right, in the Psalms. He wants to gaze at the beauty of God. Why? Because that itself is the telos. That itself is the end, why he exists, what he's made for, why Christianity exists. Well, from that approach, suddenly the Trinity should be approached with the eyes of contemplation, to know who God is, as the Reformed confessions and catechisms say, and to enjoy the Trinity. Once that's in place and we understand the Trinity correctly, biblically, then actually we're not trying to pressure ourselves into, okay, I've got to then make this Trinity a paradigm for whichever societal ecclesiastical agenda I have. When you do that, of course, then you've got to go for a social Trinitarianism, because you got the classical categories no longer matter at that point. They don't work. You need something that parallels a society to make the Trinity the paradigm for how we operate in the church or in wider society.
Matthew, I wanted to revisit some of again, this is early on in the book, and it's actually something that you wrote about pre-commitment. So in this retrieval project, what you say is these pre-commitments formed, well, the way you put it is, together they formed a rope that could weather the storm. They're strands that together form a rope that could weather the storm. And you mentioned four: a hermeneutical pre-commitment, metaphysical pre-commitment, theological pre-commitment, and canonical pre-commitment, or pre-commitments in those cases. And I wonder if you could explain that a little bit. Not so much even unpacking each of them, but what you're getting at there, because the point that you seem to be making is, look, there are some basic foundational elements that we have to have in place in order to even begin to enter into this discussion.
Yeah. Thanks for picking up on this. I was hoping this would come up, because in some ways this was the most important thing I could say. We all bump into Christians out there who might, best case scenario, say, well, okay, sure, yeah, I believe in the Nicene Creed and what it says. But nonetheless, as they start to go about their theology, or let alone apply it, you begin to notice wait a minute, you're saying things when it comes to hermeneutics, the doctrine of God, etc., Christology, that seem inconsistent with the Nicene Creed. Now, the objection is always, well, so let's just take metaphysics for a minute and talk about divine simplicity, something I've heard James cares about.
I do, actually. You heard right.
James, maybe you've had this experience, right? You sit down with another believer and they're like, well, simplicity is not even mentioned in the creed. But I don't need to believe that. And it doesn't make sense. And I don't see a scriptural proof text for it anyway. So I'm perfectly Trinitarian, rejecting it. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. But that's a very common reaction. One of them is they've missed the context of the creed, right? Because when you go back to the church fathers and the context in which they wrote it, of course, simplicity is behind it. I would be so bold to say I don't think they can write it the way they do or affirm what they say without divine simplicity. It's that important. They don't have to say it because it's almost like the fabric that holds the whole thing together. And so when we think of statements like, we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God of true God, begotten, not made. All of this assumes, well, in order to say he's true God of true God, that's a pre-commitment that's lingering behind the scenes that Jesus must mean something along the lines of divine simplicity when he says, I am one with the Father. And so we began to work out what that means metaphysically even. Well, we could go down the list. The point, though, is there has to be in place certain pre-commitments, not just to make sense of the creed, but to be what we call pro-Nicene. And so that was my attempt to maybe push people, challenge them to not, there's a temptation to say, well, I'm not modern, but nonetheless, it's affected us. And there can still be a temptation there to say, well, I can hold on to the minimum creedally. Meanwhile, I can criticize or reject the metaphysical or even hermeneutical or Christological pre-commitments that make those commitments possible in the first place. In other words, this is a long-winded way of saying I'm trying to challenge readers and listeners to think about why we get to this point where we can, on a Sunday morning, confess these words together.
Couple questions on that. The book moves through different sections. Some of them are more dogmatic in character, some of them historical. Maybe first to the historical, in terms of, you have the pre-Nicene, the Nicene, the post-Nicene, but in so much as these are agreed, we could call them all pro-Nicene in a way. Even the pre-Nicene would be pro-Nicene as much as they're anticipating it, I suppose. Your book has people from various traditions writing in this, the fundamental commitment of which is the doctrine of the Nicene Creed, and then expositing some aspect of that. Let's just take like a big transition. Carl Trueman writes a chapter reforming the Trinity, but he's certainly not claiming that the Reformed discovered a lost Trinity or something like that. So how should we understand the commonality between East and West and even Protestant and Catholic that seems to be there on the Trinity? Yeah. And what importance is that, or is that just static and irrelevant?
Yeah.
I'm not looking for a kind of hugging out the Reformation here. You know me well enough to know that's not the end game.
Yeah. So James, I really had to think through this same type of question years back. I was writing a book. It's out now. It's called The Reformation is Renewal. And I had a lot of conversations with Carl during that process. He was so helpful because as I was writing it, I realized I was making an argument along these lines. I was saying, listen, when we so many of us love the Reformation, and or we could go further and talk about the Reformed tradition. However, there has been a tendency in our circles to think like they were doing something new. Or, worst case scenario, we might even be tempted to think they were reinventing the doctrine of God in Christ. And Carl's really helpful here. And this comes out in my book. I argued, actually, when you go back, and I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Richard Muller at this point, right? When you go back and listen to them, you listen to the different reformers and their different corners, they all more or less think, no, we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're actually trying to be faithful. And so they could assume, they didn't need to necessarily argue with their Roman Catholic counterparts over, say, the Trinity or Christology and any number of other doctrines, because they considered themselves orthodox along with them. And that then meant, okay, turning our attention to the more polemical issues over, say, soteriology or ecclesiology, which occupied a lot of their attention. But on these other matters of orthodoxy, in fact, it would have, let me put it this way, it would have undermined the Reformation if they could not have responded and said, no, we are absolutely orthodox on these creedal matters. That's no question at all. Now let's proceed to talk about the church and soteriology. It would have completely destroyed their credibility. And they did have to argue that to some extent, to say, no, we too are part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We're not like these radicals. So now there was, if I'm hearing you right, James, there's another part of that, right? Because to that question, because it does bring up the issue of East and West. When we go back to the fathers and the development there. There has, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but there has been a tendency in the 20th century to pit East and West against each other. This was very advantageous for social Trinitarianism because a social Trinitarian could go back and say, hey, we're going to grab onto the East because they were faithful. They held on to the three persons. Let's get rid of Augustine in the West. All this nonsense about
the de Regnon thesis of exactly. Augustine actually got rid of the social Trinitarianism that was really there in the past, that kind of thing.
That predated him, and he's corrupting the Trinity. I mean, this stuff can preach, and it really did. People latched onto it. Well, yeah, I mean, that's not the main focus of this book, but it comes out because we have to take a look at that history. And I think by now enough historians have said, yeah, that thesis doesn't really work because it doesn't take long to open a Gregory or an Athanasius or a John of Damascus. It doesn't take long to open some of these figures and realize, yes, of course, they're emphasizing Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they also seem to have a pre-commitment to the unity and simplicity of the three persons. What do you do with that? Well, it started to really dismantle the whole caricature in the first place. All that to say, it's not that there are no differences between East and West. I don't want to give that impression, but it's been overplayed at times and maybe given a license to some unorthodox Trinitarian approaches lately.
You also, in the book, we've got a few more minutes here. You also, some of the distribution is topical, having to do, I mean, everyone, it's all conversant with the past, but it's not merely a book of history. It's also a book of Christian dogmatics or theology. And in particular, several chapters devoted to relating one or another feature of what might be called classical theism, immutability, aseity, eternity, these kinds of doctrines. My own chapter on simplicity. These kind of relating these classical attributes to the Trinity, in part because it seems like social Trinitarianism actually kind of erodes even those doctrines, or needs those doctrines to be minimized in order to achieve its goal of a kind of society of distinct minds that have to relate to each other through some sort of dialectical process.
Yeah.
That's you have to blow up simplicity and immutability and all that just to pull that off. So a big part of the book, and readers will see this, is actually bringing sort of classical attributes of God, distinct ones, into conversation with the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity, which I would argue is the biblical doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah, and I really pushed for this because obviously it makes the book much longer, twice as long, really. But it's so important because if you let go of those classical theism and those perfections, that some of which you've mentioned, like simplicity or immutability or impassibility, it becomes very difficult to maintain the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity. And the fathers, they knew this, right? So when they're describing the eternal generation of the Son, they're asking themselves, well, how do we distinguish the Son's generation from the Father in a way that doesn't fall into some of the limitations and imperfections even of a human experience of generation? Well, they started to appeal to this classical understanding of these attributes. Well, yes, the Son is begotten from the Father, but he is immutably begotten. Let's make that clear. And yes, he's begotten, but he's eternally, timelessly begotten from the Father. Contrary to Arianism, there never was once when the Son was not. My own chapter tries to, I try to put my finger on this with impassibility.
Athanasius says that explicitly, that he's impassibly begotten. I mean, this is if you don't say that, you'll lose the creator-creature distinction as you try to explain the Trinity.
100%. And I think Athanasius understands this isn't a minor issue. If he's not impassibly begotten, how then can I argue against these Arians who are afraid that that's going to compromise the deity of the Father? This is right on the front of their minds. And the funny thing, James, is when they say things like this, they almost say it in passing. It was a real struggle for me because I went back to their works and I'm like, okay, I really need some meat here to be able to write a whole chapter. But in their minds, it's like, of course, they just say it in passing as they're describing eternal generation or spiration, because the assumption is, well, if this is the Triune God, we have to preclude any type of finite limitations or imperfections that would compromise deity to begin with. So all that to say, I think one of the struggles of the past century is we've jumped right into the Trinity without realizing, hold on, if you let go of classical theism, it is really hard. I might even say it's impossible to be consistent then with the Trinity of the Nicene Creed, but ultimately the Trinity of the Bible.
I agree with you. I think that is a kind of liability for the modern reader, because there is just a world of theological assumption that they're taking for granted about how God is in terms of, let us just call it like divine metaphysics or something like that, like how God is in terms of being, that they're not making an argument for, because it's like even Arius would have conceded those things. So it's like the heretics and the Orthodox all had this common base of agreement, which turns out to itself be true, which precluded any need to actually fight about it or write long treatises on it. And so you could have these sort of almost throwaway lines that really do carry a lot of weight, but they just didn't need to be elaborated because there was no dispute going on about them. Whereas now the modern reader who doesn't hold those commitments goes back there, and then he doesn't find a big treatise on it. And so he doesn't feel like, well, perhaps it wasn't important, or perhaps it was so important it didn't need to be said because everybody worth anything knew it.
I have often found I don't open with this, because I do want to be pastoral and really people who are suspicious kind of walk through it with them, because there can be real intellectual struggles. But sometimes we need to say it, right? Sometimes we have to say, hey, listen, you realize that even those who were heterodox in the fourth century, for example, still would have assumed these attributes of classical theism. That was not the debate. The debate was actually, should these be true of the Son or the Spirit? Okay, that's where the debate. But whether they were true, that was not up for grabs. But you're right.
Yeah.
Today, this is where I think there needs to be some reformation, right? Because today we might even be worse off where we can't even assume those attributes.
Yeah.
Matthew, I wish we could continue to talk. This is a big book, and it covers a lot of ground. And so thanks for introducing us to it and talking a little bit about it. We really appreciate your time today, and especially, I can say, appreciate your labors in putting all this together and getting it out there.
Hey, thank you so much. And I just have to say, go and read James's chapter. I know James wants me to say this. If you don't understand anything, just read James's chapter.
Read Matthew's introduction, then explore the whole book.
Thanks, Matthew.
Absolutely.
Well, James, this is a difficult interview, not because of the guest, but and not because we don't think highly of his work, but just because it's such a big book and it has so many authors, and we could get into the weeds about various arguments that are made, various people who are included, that kind of thing. But suffice it to say, it is a remarkable book in its scope and in its depth.
40 authors, nearly 800 pages, covering the history, the dogma, particular implications, contemporary issues, historic issues. So, I mean, it really is quite, and it must be in that respect one of the most comprehensive books put together on the issue of Nicene Trinitarianism, certainly in the last half millennia. Let's put it that way.
Well, and we should say for our listeners, if this isn't obvious enough already, this is not an introductory book. We're encouraging anyone and everyone to read it, but it's not a lot of the books that we try to highlight or are really written for everyone and accessible to anyone. This is a book that has some difficult sections to it. It's written in an academic tone, and it is technical in some respects, but because of that, there's great value to it. So the title again is On Classical Trinitarianism, Retrieving the Nicene Doctrine of the Triune God. And our friends at IVP have given us a few copies that we can give away to you. You can enter for the chance to win a copy of this big book. You can do that at placefortruth.org or at theologyonthego.org. And if you know someone who might be helped by this episode or other episodes, please pass it along. And if you can rate and review the podcast, just takes a few minutes, and it really helps us get the word out to others. We'd appreciate that. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or at placefortruth.org. There's a donate button on both of those pages. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.